Je suis vraiment très heureux de voir cet amphi aussi plein. Je dois vous l'avouer, c'est très heureux pour plusieurs raisons. La première, c'est au regard de la qualité de ce que nous allons vous proposer ce soir avec M. Lester Brown, que nous sommes ravis d'accueillir, mais je vais y revenir. Et puis aussi heureux parce que c'est le premier événement que nous organisons au sein d'un cycle de conférences dont vous avez un petit peu entendu parler. Il y en aura plusieurs cette année et je crois que nous démarrons en beauté aujourd'hui avec la présentation du nouveau livre de M. Lester Brown, Basculement. Rapidement, vous rappeler de quoi il va s'agir cette année. Nous allons nous retrouver à plusieurs reprises. Tout ça sous la houlette de l'ISTOM, certes, mais plus spécialement de M. Licia, qui est là au premier rang, et qui va organiser avec vous un cycle de conférences à raison de 2 par semestre, organisés par nous. Le reste des conférences, vous le savez sans aucun doute, ce sera vous qui devrez les organiser. Donc je sais que M. Licia a déjà eu des contacts avec certains d'entre vous, avec Ciné d'ailleurs aussi, l'association qu'il ne faut pas laisser en marge au sein de ce dispositif. Donc voilà, une brève introduction pour vous dire combien je suis heureux de vous retrouver en cette heure un peu tardive dans un amphi frais pour inaugurer ce cycle de conférences annuelles. Voilà. Maintenant, inaugurons cette conférence en vous présentant rapidement ce qui va vous attendre aujourd'hui. J'espère que vous avez mesuré, que vous allez mesurer l'immense honneur que nous avons ce soir de recevoir M. Lester Brown. Vous avez sans aucun doute, à travers quelques lectures, quelques recherches sur le web, ce qu'ont pu vous dire les enseignants d'anglais, mesuré, pris l'ampleur de ce que faisait, du message que portait M. Lester Brown, qui est avec nous ce soir. Donc, c'est vrai que nous n'aurons pas forcément l'occasion, au cours des prochaines conférences, de vous proposer des invités qui seront de ce niveau-là, mais les thèmes que nous aborderons, eux, seront extrêmement intéressants. Voilà. Donc je tenais, au nom de l'ISTOM, en votre nom sans aucun doute aussi, à remercier M. Lester Brown. Thank you very much. Et à vous inviter bien évidemment à être très attentif à ce qu'il va vous dire. Vous verrez que si M. Lester Brown est là aussi ce soir, c'est parce que nous avons commencé à tisser un partenariat avec lui, qui se traduit aujourd'hui par un livre qui est édité par des éditeurs dont nous sommes partenaires. Le jeu ce soir, c'est bien évidemment d'écouter ce qu'il va vous dire. Il va vous rappeler les piliers finalement de son message. Mais nous attendons qu'une fois son message, sa conférence achevée, vous soyez dans l'interaction et que vous soyez capable d'intervenir et de lui poser des questions. Profitez-en, ce genre d'opportunité, vous ne l'aurez pas tous les jours. Donc, n'ayez pas peur, lancez-vous. On n'est pas en train de préparer le TOEIC ce soir. Je pense que c'est vraiment une opportunité aujourd'hui d'avoir un éclairage particulier par un penseur particulier qui délivre un message qui est entendu à travers le monde entier. Donc, saisissez l'opportunité, jetez-vous à l'eau, posez vos questions. N'ayez pas peur de cette barrière de la langue, même si pour certains d'entre vous, ça ne pose aucun problème. Et je suis persuadé que M. Lester Brown sera ravi de vous répondre. Je crois qu'il est assez sensible au fait d'avoir ce public-là ce soir. Nous lui avons expliqué ce qu'était l'ISTOM, la raison qui vous avait amené à choisir cette école et le projet personnel qui est le vôtre et qui, j'en suis persuadé, entrera fortement en résonance avec ce qu'il va nous dire ce soir. Voilà, je vais passer la parole maintenant à quelqu'un grâce auquel cette conférence ce soir a été possible. C'est monsieur que vous voyez assis à la gauche de M. Brown, qui est Philippe Vieille. Donc Philippe connaît M. Brown depuis longtemps, a pu nous faire partager ce soir le projet qui est celui du livre et l'a mené à venir nous voir à Cergy-Pontoise. Donc je vais laisser Philippe, qui par ailleurs est un ancien élève de l'ISTOM, nous faire une petite introduction aussi autour de l'action qu'il mène globalement et en particulier avec M. Lester Brown. Voilà, je voudrais une dernière fois, avant de démarrer ça, peut-être pas forcément vous redemander vos applaudissements, mais vraiment mesurez bien la chance qu'on a ce soir de l'avoir. Merci beaucoup.
Eh bien, bonsoir. Je vais m'exprimer en français avec l'aval de Lester Brown. Moi aussi, je suis très content d'être parmi vous ce soir. Comme l'a rappelé Éric Ducoudray, j'ai fait cette école. J'en suis diplômé depuis 1988, ce qui ne nous rajeunit pas. I say that I've been graduated in 1988. I've been graduated in 1988. I'm not that young. Effectivement, comme l'a dit Éric Ducoudray, on a commencé une collaboration avec Lester Brown en 2006 précisément. We started together in 2006. On s'est rencontrés à Washington pour la traduction de son livre qui s'intitulait Plan B et qui a été à l'époque traduit par Pierre-Yves Longaretti, qui est ici, relu par Olivier Grosse, qui est là, et préfacé par Nicolas Hulot, qui est à l'étranger. Ça a été un événement pour tous les gens qui ont participé à cette aventure, parce que le livre a bien marché. Il y a un entrefilet dans le Nouvel Observateur aujourd'hui qui mentionne Plan B comme un best-seller. Je n'en ai pas souvenir dans mes comptes, mais visiblement, ça avait quand même marché, puisqu'on avait fait 15 000 exemplaires d'un livre d'un environnementaliste américain à une époque où le Grenelle démarrait. Donc quelques mots sur Lester Brown. Donc Lester Brown est un agroéconomiste. Vous voyez à peu près ce que ça veut dire. Qui a consacré beaucoup de son temps à alerter sur l'état du monde à travers deux organismes qu'il a fondés. Le premier qui s'appelle World Watch Institute, qui est à Washington, et plus récemment, en 2001, le Earth Policy Institute, qui est un groupe d'une dizaine de chercheurs qui travaillent à réfléchir sur l'état du monde et publier régulièrement des notes sur un certain nombre de problématiques importantes. Lester Brown est souvent considéré par la presse comme un des 100 penseurs les plus influents de la planète. Il parcourt le monde dans tous les sens, et à cause de nous, depuis 24 heures, c'est la France. On était à Lyon ce matin, on a fait une conférence à Lille à midi, on est avec vous ce soir. C'est quelqu'un qui a une voix qui porte parce qu'il analyse les problèmes, et il a une perception visionnaire de ce que pourrait être l'évolution de notre planète et de notre civilisation. Évidemment, il en parlera. Plan B a été un moment marquant. Et quand on travaille sur son nouveau livre, intitulé World on the Edge, et que l'on a traduit par Basculement, on constate que les perceptions qu'il avait de l'évolution de notre civilisation, 5 ans plus tard, sont malheureusement avérées. Et je dis malheureusement parce que ce n'est pas nécessairement dans le bon sens que ces prévisions allaient. Et donc, cette alerte fait qu'il y a de plus en plus de gens qui sont sensibles à son message. Sa venue, effectivement, est un événement. En même temps, on a voulu, en termes de stratégie éditoriale, si je peux employer ce terme, on a voulu publier ce livre, donc, qui est publié avec le soutien de l'Ecole, ce qui est un acte important. On a également un autre livre qui sort en même temps, qui s'appelle Rebond, qui est publié avec le Centre des jeunes dirigeants, qui est un livre de témoignages sur la notion de la performance globale, c'est-à-dire la performance environnementale, sociale, économique notamment, qu'on appelle aussi RSE. Et c'est un livre de témoignages de gens qui disent que eux, à leur petit niveau, ils ont mis en œuvre les réflexions et les interrogations de Lester Brown et d'autres pour relever économiquement le défi écologique. Et on se rend compte que les entreprises qui s'engagent dans cette démarche, les dirigeants qui s'engagent dans cette démarche, y compris dans les collectivités territoriales, sont généralement des gens, dès qu'on est soucieux de l'environnement, on est aussi soucieux de la société. Donc on est plus performant socialement et parfois pour les entreprises même plus performant économiquement. Voilà. Donc on est très loin de ce qu'on appelle le greenwashing, on est très loin du marketing vert, on est très loin de l'affichage. On est très loin de l'affichage, on est plutôt dans une réflexion de fond qui amène à des modifications assez substantielles de notre façon de percevoir les choses. Je terminerai en disant que il y a aussi un intérêt pour Lester Brown à participer à une conférence devant une audience jeune, de gens qui sont en formation et qui sont aussi ceux qui vont devoir, avec nous, se retrousser les manches pour modifier un certain nombre de paradigmes économiques notamment. Voilà. Lester, I finished. Maybe it's your turn. You can click that. Okay.
Are the lights going to be turned up? I always like to be able to see the audience. That way I can tell who's sleeping and who's awake. This is an interesting experience for me. I often lecture at universities, but I rarely ever have an agricultural set of majors, group of majors like this to talk with. And as you may or may not know, my roots are in agriculture. I'm going to talk about something I've never talked about before. I'm going to talk about global environmental issues in a minute, just to show you how I got from where you are to where I am now. When I was 13, I went into high school. I grew up in a farming community and on a farm in southern New Jersey. For those not steeped in U.S. geography, that's between New York and Washington. And at 13, I entered high school, secondary school, and had to choose a major. We had a number of majors, but one was agriculture. And that was the one I selected because I planned to be a farmer. Already my younger brother and I were starting to do some things together. And while in high school, as an agricultural major, you had to have agricultural projects. You had to do things, either on a farm, or if you didn't live on a farm, then you had to work on a farm to get the experience. And among the things that my brother and I did, my brother was a bit younger than I am, was we grew tomatoes. This was our biggest thing. The last year I farmed, which was 1958, we marketed 1.5 million pounds of tomatoes, 700,000 kilograms. We also grew chickens, broilers, and we grew pheasants. We grew pheasants for the New Jersey Department of Fish and Wildlife. And in the early spring, they would give us the one-day-old pheasant chicks, about so big, and we would raise 400, 500, 600 of them. And then when they were 12 weeks old, the Division of Fish and Wildlife would come and take them in crates and spread them around New Jersey. It was a way of maintaining the pheasant population in New Jersey, and we got $1 for each of them. So that was at that time, a very profitable activity for us. So I was immersed in agriculture in high school, not just in studying it, but also in actually farming. And then I went to the land-grant University of New Jersey, which is Rutgers University, which had a very good College of Agriculture. And because I was going to be a farmer, they had a major called General Agricultural Science. And it provided an opportunity to pick, aside from the basic course requirements, to pick courses that you thought would be of use to you as a farmer. And this, for me, was a very exciting experience because I ended up taking many science courses in different fields. Instead of specializing, which is the tendency in this general agricultural science major, you could range back and forth across the horizon. So I was just thinking of courses that I took. They included biology, microbiology, chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry, and then courses like meteorology, climatology, entomology, plant pathology, soils, soil physics, and on and on. It was just a huge number of science courses, not specialized, but spread out. And what I have since come to realize is that my interest in and my capacity to do systemic analysis and writing, not in a particular discipline, but across the board, had its roots in my agricultural experience and also in my very broad education in the agricultural sciences. I mention that just to give you a sense of where my roots are. And then after graduating from Rutgers, I had a chance to go to India and live in villages for half a year, living with village farm families. This was part of a program called the International Farm Youth Exchange Program, where young American farmers would live in other countries. I think we had this exchange with some 40 countries around the world. I was selected to go to India with as a group of 10 young American farmers, six guys and four gals. And we sailed from New York to Bombay, India, going across the Atlantic through the Straits of Gibraltar, the Mediterranean, changing ships in Naples, and then going on to the Eastern Mediterranean through the Suez Canal. We stopped in Aden, now Yemen, and then across the Persian Gulf, down the coast, stopped in Karachi, and then ended up in Bombay. It took nearly a month to make that trip, but it was great fun and interesting. And then living in Indian villages for half a year, coming back to the States. I was growing tomatoes at the time, and I continued growing tomatoes for another couple of years. And while I was in India, I was thinking, what a neat experience. And incidentally, my brother took care of harvesting the tomatoes. It was the last half of 1956 that I was in India. And I was thinking to myself, what a neat experience this is, to have a chance to live in Indian villages in central India and southern India, then in northern India, near the Himalayas. But I didn't, at the time, think it was going to change what I wanted to do. I was doing what I wanted to do, which was to grow tomatoes, and I planned to grow tomatoes the rest of my life. But after a couple of years, I began to realize that I was interested in the world food and population problem. And obviously, having been in India sort of stimulated that thinking about these issues, and then came back, grew tomatoes for a couple more years, and then in 1959 joined the Foreign Agricultural Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And my first assignment in the regional analysis division of that agency was the Rice Bowl countries. It was up to me to track the agricultural developments in Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And then after a bit, I became the Asia regional economist. And then a year or two later, did the first set of projections of world agricultural supply and demand to the end of the century. And that was sort of the book, my very first, that sort of got things started. And I later became advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture. They created a foreign policy advisor position. And then we had started a new agency in the Department of Agriculture. The Foreign Agricultural Service existed to promote U.S. farm products abroad. It was basically a marketing intelligence operation. The lights are going down. The International Agricultural Development Service, which was newly created when John Kennedy was president, was an international technical assistance program. And the purpose of it was to take advantage of the technical resources of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which, as I recall, had 110,000 employees at the time. And we had extraordinary talent in the Forest Service, the Soil Conservation Service, the Agricultural Research Service, 17 agencies in the Department of Agriculture. And I became the administrator of the International Agricultural Development Service at a fairly early age, and as an agency head, had the responsibility for managing those technical assistance programs in some 40 countries. So just by way of background, my interests in my early years are very similar to yours and what you're training for and planning to do. With that background on sort of my agricultural roots and interests, I would like to talk a bit about the world that you are now facing, what's happening to it, and I'm going to look at it primarily through a food lens. The book that's just been published here in English is called World on the Edge. The reason for this title is it's in a series of books that we've been publishing for several years called Plan B. Plan B 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. This could have been 5.0, but I chose to change the title. And I chose the title World on the Edge because I wanted to focus on the urgency, the lack of time we have to turn around the environmental trends that are threatening our future. Last summer, we saw in Russia an intense heat wave. One of the most intense, probably the most intense heat wave that Russia had ever experienced. We saw a country with intense heat and drought. We saw fires burning out of control throughout large parts of Western Russia. If you were watching television early last summer, you were watching the smoke-filled streets of Moscow. 56,000 people died in Russia from heat stress and from respiratory problems from breathing the smoke-filled air. But the thing that affected the entire world was that the Russian grain harvest, which they had been hoping would be about 100 million tons, dropped to 60 million tons. So Russia and the world lost 40 million tons of grain as a result of that heat wave and drought. And we saw grain prices start rising in late summer and keep rising into the fall. We saw the World Food Price Index in January of this year, reach the highest level on record. So we're beginning now to see some of the effects of climate change on food security. We can see how extreme an intense heat wave can be. If someone had said to me in January of last year, there's going to be a heat wave in Western Russia, And the average temperature in Moscow during the month of July will be 14 degrees Fahrenheit above the norm, 8 degrees Celsius above the norm. I would have said, no, that's not going to happen. I'm not a climate denier, but that's just too extreme. We can't, it won't happen. But it did happen. In retrospect, we're lucky that heat wave was centered in Moscow, because if it had been centered in Chicago, in the center of the U.S. Midwestern grain belt, and if we had lost 40% of our harvest, it would have been 40% of 400 million tons of grain, or 160 million tons of grain. If that heat wave had been centered in Chicago, we would have seen chaos in world grain markets. We would have seen grain prices going to levels we've never seen before. We would have seen food riots. Instead of watching smoke-filled streets in Moscow on television, we would have been watching food riots in countries all over the world, particularly in the developing countries. We would have seen governments falling, because one of the things people expect of their governments, there are two things that they expect. One is personal security, the other is food security. And if governments cannot provide food security, then they're likely to be in trouble. So we would have seen a degree of political instability, perhaps unlike anything we've seen before. In looking at when we look back at early civilizations, the ones whose archaeological sites we now study, more often than not, food was the reason for their decline. We look at the Sumerians, for example. For them, it was rising salt levels in the soil. They were a remarkable civilization with an ingenious irrigation system, but there was a flaw in that irrigation system that led to a rise in groundwater over time. When that groundwater rose to near the surface, the water started evaporating into the atmosphere, but the salt in the water, and all underground water has a certain amount of salt and minerals in it, the salt in the water did not evaporate, obviously. It concentrated on the surface of the soil until wheat yields started to drop. Then they substituted barley for wheat because barley is more salt tolerant, but eventually the barley yields also began to fall, and with the fall in barley yields came the decline and collapse of the civilization. For the Mayans in Central America, it was deforestation and soil erosion that undermined their agriculture and eventually led to the decline of what at that time was the most advanced civilization in the Western Hemisphere. So the idea that food could be the weak link in our modern civilization is one that for a long time I rejected. But in recent years, I've come to think not only that food could be the weak link, but that food is the weak link. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why I think that's the case. If we look at the demand side of the food equation, we see population growth, 80 million a year. On the 30th of next month, according to the UN demographers, world population will reach 7 billion. It has more than tripled during my lifetime. It has doubled since I lived in the villages in India in 1956. More than doubled. So we're seeing enormous population growth. What this translates into, 80 million a year, is that there are 219,000 people at the dinner table tonight who were not there last night. And tomorrow night there will be another 219,000. Now, if this keeps going on for day after day, year after year, decade after decade, at some point it begins to put excessive pressure on the Earth's land and water resources. And that's where we are today. In addition to population growth, we now have rising affluence. We have maybe 3 billion people in the world, a large part of them in China, moving up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products. So rising affluence is also increasing the demand for grain. And then thirdly, we have a rather new source of demand for grain, which is using it to produce fuel for cars. In the United States, last year, we harvested 400 million tons of grain. Of that, 124 million tons went to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars. The grain required to fill a large gas tank on, say, a sport utility vehicle, 25 gallons, the grain required to fill that tank with ethanol once will feed one person for a year. So this is not a solution to the world's shrinking oil reserves. We've got to come up with something better, and I'll talk about some of the other options. So here we are. We have population growth, we have rising affluence, and we have the growing use of grain to fuel cars. We have 3 sources of additional demand now, which means that the annual growth in world grain demand, which a decade ago averaged about 20 million tons a year, is now close to 40 million tons a year. So each year, the world's farmers must up their production by about 40 million tons. This is on a base, a world grain harvest of just over 2 billion tons. On the supply side, we have climate change, we have spreading water shortages, and we have a shrinking backlog of unused agricultural technology. Climate change is I think, going to be the game changer. We have seen agriculture evolve over an 11,000-year period of rather remarkable climate stability. There have been blips along the way, but basically, since the end of the last ice age, the Earth's climate's been remarkably stable. Agriculture has evolved with that climate system to maximize production. Now, that climate system is no more. It is changing. Agriculture, as it evolved, was designed to maximize production with the existing climate system. They were entirely in sync with each other. Now the climate system is changing, and agriculture is not changing very much. So increasingly, with each passing year, the climate system is more and more out of sync with agriculture. And that's making it more difficult for the world's farmers to expand production fast enough. Heat, I'm going to do a little biology now. Heat is particularly threatening to grain crops during the pollination period. And corn, maize, which is the dominant grain in the United States, is particularly vulnerable to intense heat. How many of you know how the corn plant reproduces? Raise your hands. The sex life of the corn plant, who knows about? We've got a few. It's complex and it's vulnerable. If you're in a cornfield, when it tassels, you have the tassel at the top, and the tassel produces pollen, and the pollen floats down. On each ear of corn, when it starts to develop, you have all the silk coming out the end. Each of those strands of silk is linked to a kernel site on the ear, and in order for a kernel of grain to develop, pollen, a grain of pollen must fall on the silk strand, and it's like a fallopian tube. It's conducted through the silk to the kernel site. Fertilization occurs, and the kernel develops. But if you get very hot weather during the pollination period, the silk can dry out and turn brown and not conduct the pollen to the kernel sites. And so you can have with corn, if you have intense heat, you can have a crop failure. I mention it because it gives a sense of how vulnerable crops are. And corn, by the way, is now the largest grain crop in the world. I think about 840 million tons this year. Wheat is second, 650 million tons. Rice is third at 450 million tons. But we're heavily dependent on grain. Grains provide half of our caloric intake consumed directly and a sizable part of the remainder consumed indirectly as meat, milk, and eggs. So climate change is a major influence on food production. Last year, because of the heat wave in Russia and the shortfall in the Russian crop, we saw world grain stocks drop. This year, we were going to rebuild grain stocks. We had very high prices at planting time in the spring. Farmers planted more grain this year. They bought more fertilizer this year. They pulled out the stops because prices were so attractive. But they've not been able to keep up with the growth in demand this year. And so we're going to have another drop in world grain stocks. This is why grain prices are so high and why food prices are so high and are likely to rise even higher. Because the nearest relief we can hope for is next fall, when next year's harvest is in. But we already know that that harvest is going to be somewhat compromised because one of the reasons the grain harvest fell short this year was not because of heat in Russia, it was because of heat in the United States. In the southern Great Plains, especially in the state of Texas, we've had extreme heat and drought. Texas has just completed the hottest 12 months in its history and the driest 12 months in its history, and it is a major wheat-producing state. Now, that was this year's crop. Now, it is time to plant next year's winter wheat. It's time to plant winter wheat for next year's harvest. But in Texas, the soil is so dry, many farmers are not bothering to plant. There's no point. There's not enough moisture to germinate the wheat. So already we're beginning to compromise next year's grain harvest when the farmers will need nearly 40 million tons of additional grain to keep up with the growth in demand. Water. The rule of thumb is it takes about 1,000 tons of water to produce 1 ton of grain. This is why countries that have very tight water supplies, like the countries in North Africa and in the Middle East, import grain. Because if you don't have enough water, you satisfy the need for water in the cities and industry, and then you import water in the form of grain. This is the most efficient way to import water since each ton of grain represents 1,000 tons of water. So we're seeing almost every country in the Middle East now importing a substantial share of their grain supply. There are now 18 countries in the world where we are overpumping aquifers in order to expand grain production. Those 18 countries contain half the world's people. They include China and India. World Bank data for India indicate that 175 million people in India are being fed with grain produced by overpumping, which by definition is a short-term process. My estimate for China is that 120 million Chinese are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. And I could go through a number of other countries, smaller countries that are also facing water shortages and are overpumping their aquifers. So if you're working in agricultural development, you're going to have a lot of issues to work on. And one of them is water shortages. Climate change I've already mentioned. If I were to pick 3 indicators that I think will tell us more about our future than any others, one would be an economic indicator, the price of grain. The second would be a social indicator, the number of hungry people in the world. The number of hungry people in the world was declining during the closing decades of the last century. It got down to about 825 million as we came into this new century. And then, instead of continuing to decline, it started increasing. It's now up to around 1 billion, and there's nothing in sight to reverse that trend that I can see. When you think about it, this is what happened to the Sumerians and the Mayans. The number of hungry people started increasing, and they couldn't stop it. And eventually it led to their decline and collapse. So these are not trivial issues, climate change, water shortages. So we have an economic indicator, grain prices, a social indicator, the number of hungry people in the world. And then the third indicator would be political, and that is the number of failing states in the world. A failing state is a country where the government no longer controls all the territory, where it can no longer provide either personal security or food security. Either one or the other, or sometimes both. These are things that people expect of their governments: personal security and food security. What are our options? I think as a civilization we're in trouble. We are in the process, I'm thinking of the development process now. We are in the process of shrinking the world's forests. We've been doing this for the last few decades, and there's no shrinkage, there's no halt of that shrinkage in sight. It's dangerous. We're seeing soil erosion on a scale we've never seen before. There were 2 huge dust bowls forming in the world. One in northern China, western Mongolia, Central Asia. These are the dust storms that come east beginning early each spring. And if you live in Beijing or any of the many other cities in the East Coast, you suffer from this. Sometimes the dust storms are so intense that government officials recommend that people not go outside. Sometimes these dust storms will remain intact all the way across the Pacific and reach the western coast of the United States. There have been times when you could write your name in the dust on your car, if you lived in California, for example. That dust is topsoil from China. In Central Africa, the Sahelian region of Africa, a huge dust bowl forming now, and the dust storms come out one after another, again carrying topsoil and much of it ending up in the Atlantic Ocean. So soil erosion is becoming a serious issue. It's a product of overpiling, overgrazing, deforestation, a whole convergence of trends, but we're not close to turning this one around. No civilization has survived the ongoing destruction of the economy's natural support systems: forests, soils, aquifers, fisheries, grasslands. No civilization has survived the ongoing destruction at the local level, nor will our global civilization survive these trends if they continue indefinitely. And one of the challenges in the development process is how to develop without deforesting the earth, without creating more soil erosion, without overpumping more aquifers. These are huge challenges. It used to be that agricultural development is sort of a checklist of things you had to do, and agriculture would begin to flourish. But we've got far more complex issues now than we had when I was in school studying agriculture as you are. It's a complex world. It's challenging. I mentioned earlier we have a series of books called Plan B. Plan B, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and so forth. The purpose of Plan B is to provide an alternative to Plan A being business as usual. I don't think business as usual is any longer a viable option. And the question only becomes then a matter of time. I mentioned in the introduction to World on the Edge that I think it's been 2 years ago, John Beddington, who had been the science advisor to the UK government, was giving a talk at the UK Sustainability Commission meeting. And he said, you know, we've been talking about these problems, and we talk about them in the distant future, you know, by 2050 or by the end of the century, this will happen or that will happen. He said, I think we need to be more realistic. And he said, I think the perfect storm, as it were, the convergence of climate change and soil erosion and water shortages and political instability, rising food prices, all those things, he said, I think are going to become evident by 2030. The next week, Jonathan Parrott, a leading environmentalist in the UK, said, I agree. And he happened to be the head of the Sustainability Commission that John Beddington was addressing. He said, I agree with John Beddington's analysis. He said, but I think it's going to be closer to 2020 than to 2030. Jonathan Parrott called it the Great Recession, from which there is no recovery. So as I was working on World on the Edge, I was thinking, how much time do we have? Do we have 20 years, as John Beddington thinks, or 10 years, as Jonathan Parrott thinks? And that's when I began thinking, you know, the what if. What if the Russian heat wave had been centered not in Moscow, but what if that had been in Chicago, in the US Midwest instead? And the bottom line is, we could see a perfect storm of trends converging that would destabilize the entire world at any time. Could be next year, could be the year after, could be 5 years from now. But it could happen anytime. We don't have to wait for things to get a lot worse before we have potentially overwhelming problems. So the alternative to business as usual is Plan B. Plan B has 4 components. Cut carbon emissions 80% by 2020. Not by 2050, which is what political leaders like to talk about, but by 2020. They start asking, what do the politics of this issue suggest we should do? And the politics, the easy thing, of course, is say we'll cut carbon emissions 80% by 2050. But if you start with the science and you ask questions like, how quickly do we have to cut carbon emissions to save the Greenland ice sheet? Or how quickly do we have to cut carbon emissions to save the major glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau? These are the glaciers whose ice melt sustains not only the major rivers of Asia during the dry season, but the irrigation systems dependent on those rivers. And those glaciers are already melting, as is the Greenland ice sheet. If the Greenland ice sheet were to melt entirely, sea level would rise 7 meters. If sea level were to rise only 1 meter, the World Bank shows a map of Bangladesh with half of its rice land underwater. A 1 meter rise in sea level would inundate part of the Mekong Delta. Vietnam is the world's #2 rice exporter. A 1 meter rise in sea level would inundate parts of 19 other rice-growing river deltas in Asia. This is not intuitively obvious. The idea that ice melting on a large island in the far North Atlantic can shrink the rice harvest of Asia, a region where half the world's people live, is not intuitively obvious until you begin thinking about it. This is where a broad-based interdisciplinary background in the sciences, which is what you're working toward, is very helpful. You can think about climate change. You can think about the effect on sea level, obviously, and you can think about the low-lying agricultural regions of the world and what the effect will be. You can think about melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau and how that will affect agricultural development in large parts of Asia. So suddenly, the world that you're facing, the world you're going out into, will be far more complex than the one I experienced when I went to live in Indian villages, for example, in 1956. The answers were pretty simple then. We knew what had to be done. After the Indian monsoon failure in 1965, before that, I was invited to India to review the agricultural part of their 5-year plan, and then saw the monsoon failure coming. We ended up, the United States, shipping a fifth of our wheat crop to India to avoid famine that year. But one of the prices for our doing that, and we were in a unique situation, we had leverage on agricultural policy because India desperately needed wheat, and we were the only country that could even come close to filling their needs that year. What we did was came up with a short agreement. In exchange for continuing food assistance from the United States, the U.S. government agrees to 1, 2, 3, 4. And number 1 was to change the agricultural price policy of India. Up until that time, they had ceiling prices for grain. They were catering to the urban elites. We required that they replace that with a support price to farmers for grain that would make it possible for farmers to have enough confidence to invest in expanding their production, knowing there would be an acceptable price when the harvest came in. That was the principal policy. The others were to move the fertilizer industry out of the government sector into the private sector. Up until that point, it had taken about 10 years to build a fertilizer plant in the government sector. The private sector could build them in 18 months. And we arranged for the importation of a couple of shiploads of high-yielding Mexican dwarf wheats, which had already been tested in India. We knew they worked. The bottom line was India doubled its wheat harvest in 7 years. I was the principal drafter of that agreement, but there were hundreds of other agricultural economists who could have done that. I mean, it was sort of obvious what needed to be done. But doubling India's wheat harvest then was not that difficult. You're facing a very different world. India is still projected, even now, to add another 500 million people in the decades ahead. But there's no simple way, no easy way to get the dramatic increases in production that will require. you're facing some extraordinary challenges in the development area, and particularly in agricultural development. Challenges that my generation never had to deal with. I mean, one of the things in this agreement with India was that they would drill more irrigation wells, which they did, but they just kept going with no stop, and now they're over pumping extensively. Cutting carbon emissions 80% by 2020. How do you do that? One way is to raise the efficiency of energy use. If you like to increase energy efficiency, this is a great time to be alive, because we have such extraordinary technologies now coming on the market, some already on the market. Consider the lighting sector. If you go from an incandescent light bulb to a compact fluorescent light bulb, you reduce electricity use by 70% or so. If you go from an incandescent light bulb to an LED, light-emitting diode, and they're now on the market, and combine that LED lighting with motion sensors in rooms, offices, rooms in your house, whatever, so that if there's no one in the room, the lights automatically go out. Then we're looking at a potential cut in electricity use for lighting of 90%. With existing technologies. We don't have to wait for someone to come up with new technologies. And incidentally, that would be enough, that would reduce electricity enough to close 705 of the world's 2,600 coal-fired power plants. Extraordinary opportunity. Consider transportation. I mean, obviously we need better public transit in many countries in the world. We see the bike sharing programs now catching on in many cities, including Washington, D.C. The game changer in this area, by the way, was Paris. It wasn't that Paris was the first city to have a bike sharing program, but it was Paris. And one didn't expect that to happen in Paris. I mean, almost anywhere but Paris. I mean, Parisians don't ride bikes, but suddenly they have this huge bike sharing program, I don't know, 23,000 bikes now or something like that, and it's become a very common sort of thing to do, to use these rental bikes. And the one in Washington, D.C. has suddenly become, just started a year ago, and it's growing at an extraordinary rate. I could go on and talk about that, but the big advance is going to come with cars. And we hope to reduce the number in a lot of countries. They're already starting to decline in the US. But the big thing is going from an internal combustion engine to an electric motor. Just that change, no change in the size of the car, the miles driven, anything else, just that change reduces energy use by 2/3. Electric motors are 3 times as efficient as internal combustion engines. So again, a huge opportunity here. And electric cars, plug-in hybrids are coming on the market. In the US, we have the Chevrolet Volt, the Nissan Leaf. The Leaf is all electric. The Volt will use some gasoline, but it'll run mostly on electricity. And Toyota, with the plug-in version of the Prius hybrid, is now taking orders in the United States, and there are many other models of cars from every major company in the world, either all electric or plug-in hybrids, that are going to enable us to run our cars on electricity. Huge opportunities on the efficiency front. Then we have renewables. Shifting from fossil fuels to renewables brings huge opportunities for cutting carbon emissions. Most of the carbon emissions in the world come from burning coal. There are alternatives. I could talk about wind, I could talk about solar, I could talk about geothermal energy. I think currently world geothermal generating capacity is about 13,000 megawatts. Solar energy 37,000 megawatts. Wind energy now 240,000 megawatts. Wind, I think, is going to emerge as the centerpiece of the new energy economy. We have seen wind farms scale up to a level we've never seen before with other sources of energy. The largest coal-fired generating complexes in the world do not exceed 5,000 megawatts. There are a few nuclear generating complexes in the 5,000 to 8,000 megawatt range. But let me tell you what's happening with wind. The early wind farms built in the US in the beginning of the 80s were maybe 50 or 100 megawatts, and then we built some with a few hundred megawatts, then some with several hundred megawatts, and then a wind farm in the development stages in Wyoming, 2,000 megawatts, one in South Dakota, 5,000 megawatts, one coming in Texas, 10,000 megawatts. That's twice as large as the largest coal-fired complexes. Texas is an interesting state. As you may know, Texas has been our leading oil producer for the last century. It is now our leading generator of electricity from wind, having passed California a few years ago. But what's so interesting about Texas is we now have oil money going into wind farms. And one of the reasons for that is the realization that if you invest in a new oil field, assuming you can find one, but if you invest in a new oil field, you know that within a few decades, the yields from the wells will begin to decline. You'll have to abandon the oil field and find another one. Or if you're mining coal, eventually the veins run out and you have to find another place to mine coal. And so, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution began, we can invest in energy sources that can last as long as the earth itself. That oil money going into wind farms in Texas is building sources of electricity that can essentially last forever. I mean, obviously you have to maintain the turbines and the associated infrastructure. Bearings wear out. You have to replace the bearings in the turbines and so forth. But the wind itself is going to be there probably as long as the earth exists. It doesn't make any difference how much wind energy you use today. It doesn't affect the supply for tomorrow. That's what's new and exciting. And that's why we now see oil money moving into wind farms in Texas. So we have a wind farm coming in the Texas Panhandle with 10,000 megawatts of generating capacity. That's equal to at least 10 average-sized coal plants. But we go to China. China is building seven wind mega complexes, each of which will have a minimum of 10,000 megawatts of generating capacity. The largest, now under construction, in fact, all seven have begun construction. The largest is in Gansu province. That's in northwestern China, where the wind is particularly strong. That wind complex will have 38,000 megawatts of generating capacity. That huge wind farm, 19,000 turbines, will produce enough electricity to satisfy the needs of a country like Poland or Egypt, for example. This one generating facility, we've not seen thinking on this scale before in the energy sector. It is extraordinary. Wind scales up, and it'll take about 4 million wind turbines to back out all the world's coal-fired electricity and oil, including that used in the form of gasoline and and the natural gas we use. But we can do it. We can do it. So the keys to restructuring the energy economy are, one, investing in efficiency and shifting from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. And that means restructuring the tax system. To get these changes quickly, we need to get the market to tell the truth. The market now only includes, when it sets the price of gasoline, only includes the direct cost. For example, in the United States, a gallon of gasoline costs less than $4 a gallon. That price reflects the cost of pumping the oil, getting it to an oil refinery, getting the gasoline to the local service station. It does not include the cost of climate change. It does not include the cost associated with treating respiratory illnesses from breathing polluted air. It does not include the cost of maintaining the huge U.S. military establishment in the Middle East to protect world access to that oil. If you include those indirect costs, then the price of gasoline is not $4 a gallon, it is $12 a gallon. But we need to get the market to tell the truth. And the way to do that is to lower income taxes and raise the carbon tax. Not change the amount of tax we pay. That remains the same. But we tax labor less and carbon more. And that will then get the market. We can keep doing that till the market tells the truth about the full price, the full cost of a gallon of gasoline. And once we do that, the investments in efficiency will soar, and the shift from fossil fuels to renewables, including wind and solar and geothermal, will accelerate dramatically. So cutting carbon emissions 80% is the first part of Plan B, and we finance that by restructuring the tax system. And the market will take care of the rest. The second, third, and fourth components are stabilizing population, eradicating poverty, and restoring the economy's natural support systems. And let me summarize these quickly. The key to stabilizing population is filling the family planning gap. There are today 215 million women in the world who want to plan their families but do not have access to family planning services. Filling that gap would cost something like $23 billion a year of additional expenditures on family planning. These women don't have to be convinced of anything. They want to plan their families. They just don't have access to the means to do so. Those 215 million women and their families represent over 1 billion people. They are, for the most part, the poorest 1 billion people in the world. The third component after population stabilization is poverty eradication. That basically means things like making sure our youngsters everywhere get at least a primary school education, girls as well as boys. And it means rudimentary health care, childhood immunizations, those sorts of things. Not huge health care expenses, minimal ones. And then the third thing is restoring natural systems. That's reforestation, it's soil conservation, it's raising water productivity, it's creating marine sanctuaries so fisheries can recover. Not big deals. Altogether, these will cost, these last three. Remember, the energy part we're going to do with tax restructuring, so there's no additional fiscal expenditures. Stabilizing population, eradicating poverty, restoring the economy's natural support systems will cost us about $200 billion a year in additional expenditures. That's a lot, particularly in these fiscally stressed times. But the key to this, the key to implementing Plan B, moving away from business as usual, which we call Plan A to Plan B, is this $200 billion in expenditures once we start restructuring taxes. How do we get $200 billion a year? Easy. we redefine security. We have inherited a definition of security from the last century, a century that was dominated by 2 world wars and a Cold War. When you use the term national security in Washington, people automatically think of the military budget and the need for more advanced weapon systems. But when I start listing the threats to security, to our security, not in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, the first item on my list is climate change, then population stabilization, then spreading water shortages, rising food prices, a growing number of failing states. These are the principal threats to our security today. And so when I talk about redefining security, I'm not talking just about an intellectual process. I'm also talking about a fiscal process. The $200 billion annual expenditures we need to implement Plan B, as I've described it, is less than 1/3 of the US military budget. It is 1/8 of the global military budget. We can't say we don't have the resources to, in effect, save civilization. This is what we're talking about. Business as usual is not going to work much longer. We've got to change direction, and we have to do it quickly. When I get to thinking about these things and think, wow, this is a lot. It is. But I go back and reread the economic history of World War II. I'm not sure there's anyone in this room that can remember World War II. I can. December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack, an air attack from aircraft carriers on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. A large part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet happened to be at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, a Sunday. And we lost a large part of our Pacific Fleet on that Sunday morning. January 6th, 1942, 1 month later, President Roosevelt gave the State of the Union address. And in that address, he said, we are going to produce 45,000 tanks. I mean, we were at war then, both in Asia and in Europe. He said, we're going to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes, and literally thousands of ships. We're faced with an enormous logistical challenge of fighting 2 wars on the far side of 2 oceans. And the American people could not relate to those numbers. There was a lot of public skepticism. Roosevelt wants to produce 45,000 tanks, 60,000 planes. I mean, we were still in a wartime mode, not a wartime, a depression mode economy. But what Roosevelt and his colleagues knew was that at that time, the largest single concentration of industrial power in the world was in the U.S. automobile industry. So after his State of the Union address, when he laid out these arms production goals, he called in the leaders of the automobile industry. And he said, because you guys represent such a large share of our industrial capacity, we're going to rely heavily on you to help us reach these arms production goals. And they said, well, Mr. President, we're going to do everything we can, but it's going to be a stretch producing cars and all these arms too. He said, you don't understand. We're going to ban the sale of private automobiles in the United States. From the beginning of April 1942 until the end of 1944, nearly 3 years, there were essentially no cars produced in the United States. And we exceeded every one of those arms production goals. In the end, we did not produce 60,000 planes, we produced 229,000 planes. I was flying into Seattle, Washington, where Boeing's headquarters have been. When I was on a book tour not too long ago, and I was thinking, 229,000 planes? It's hard today, even today, to imagine that, and we're talking about 70 years ago almost. The point of this example is that it did not take decades to restructure the US industrial economy. It did not take years. We did it in a matter of months. I remember seeing the film footage of one of Ford Motor Company's large production plants in Willow Run, Michigan. It covered, I think, 78 acres, which would be what? Over 30 hectares. And they were producing B-24 bombers on the assembly line. And they had opened up an end of the plant because the bombers are big, and they were coming off the assembly line one after another, 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they just kept coming. It was extraordinary. But the thing is, you can also produce wind turbines on assembly lines. Imagine simply mobilizing the idled automobile manufacturing capacity in the United States or elsewhere in the world. There's a excess capacity factor in the world automobile industry. It was close to 30% a couple of years ago. It's probably down to maybe 20% now, but that's huge. I mean, we'd have to produce 300,000 wind turbines a year to reach the goal that I mentioned earlier of backing out all the coal-fired power, for example, and oil and natural gas-fired power. 300,000 turbines is a lot, but we produce 70 million cars each year in the world, so it's not that much. I mean, it would take an effort, no question, and we'd have to do that for the next decade, but we could basically produce enough wind turbines that we could largely run the world economy from wind alone. We can do it. It's going to take an extraordinary mobilization. It'll be more like World War II probably than anything else in recent history. But we can turn these trends around. We have the resources, we have the technologies. What we now need is some leadership. And much of that leadership is going to come from you and from your generation. So as you're studying here, I know it gets to be a bit of a grind sometimes, but think of these challenges and keep them in mind as you think about the development process and about what you might end up doing in that process. How you help a country convert from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy. How you help developing countries start with renewable sources. They don't have to build coal plants and then close them somewhere down the road because the world can no longer deal with the carbon emissions and climate change that result. So these are the kinds of issues that you're going to be facing. In some ways, I envy you. Some of my most fulfilling times were as an agricultural student in high school and then in college. You're having a great opportunity here in terms of educational potential. This is a great place to be. Thank you very much for coming out tonight, and I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you. Ça marche? So, thank you, Lester, for this nice conference. I must admit that your book is not the funniest book I ever read.
Excuse me?
It's not the funniest.
Oh.
However, what has been extremely interesting in this conference is that you started by stimulate the curiosity of the students, and they're willing to stimulate their willingness to improve their knowledge and to be confident in their capability to act in a proper manner, to move things in the proper way. We have titled your book, Basculement. That means that we are at the edge, but it's still possible to go in the good side of this edge. And that's a point that I want to focus further to your evening talk. Now I suggest that if you've got some questions to ask to Mr. Brown, it's time for the room questions.
Maybe you should call me Lester instead of Mr. Brown.
Okay, Mr. Prime Minister. No, it's a joke because I remind him the famous debate between Chirac and Mitterrand, because a few years ago when Lester came here, it was to meet François Mitterrand with Al Gore, and we have discussed a little bit about Mitterrand. And during the presidential debate in 1988, Mitterrand was playing with Chirac, calling him Mr. Prime Minister. That made him upset. And during the debate, he asked Mitterrand to stop to ask him to call him Mr. Prime Minister. And Mitterrand answered, "As you wish, Mr. Prime Minister." I told him this morning, that's why I remember this. Okay, should you have any questions?
Okay. There's a roving mic, I think.
Hi, and thank you for being there. So I just want to ask a question about the last thing we talked about. You said that we can produce with, like you say that during the World War II, they stopped to building cars to make tanks or plane, and so now I think that you want to say that we can keep our system of production to create different things, but like stopping building cars for creating, for the winds power. I don't know the name in English for eolian turbines. And what kind of things can help us, or who can ask and determine the people to starting of building different things, but keeping our system of production?
I interrupted myself and forgot what I was going to say. One of the things I did not talk about was that we're now looking at threats to civilization itself. We as environmentalists have been saying for decades, we need to save the planet. But as I think about it, the planet's probably going to be around for some time to come. The challenge now is to save civilization, as I see it. And that is not a spectator sport. It's not something where we can sit around and hope someone's going to take care of it. We all have a stake in it, so we need to make sure it happens. And for me, in many cases, that translates into becoming politically active. I mean, not just in presidential campaigns, but becoming politically active, finding some friends who share your concerns about an issue, like closing coal-fired power plants, for example, or working with international family planning groups to help them strengthen their programs. Pick an issue that's important to you. Maybe it's developing a world-class recycling program in your community, because recycling is one of the most effective ways of reducing energy use. But it means we can no longer just sort of wait for things to happen. We've got to help them happen. Let me give an example. 2 years ago at the Copenhagen conference, the US government did not distinguish itself. And I did not expect it to. I did not expect much I did not expect much of Copenhagen for the simple reason that I think internationally negotiated climate agreements have probably become obsolete and we haven't realized it. But living in Washington, D.C. as I do, I was watching two separate cultures. One was the diplomatic, official Washington culture. And the purpose of that and of the delegation we sent was to see how little we could concede in terms of cutting carbon emissions or what have you. It was a minimalist sort of frame of mind. Instead of saying, how can we set an example by doing the most, we were looking at, and this is one of the problems with international agreements. There's this mindset of each country not wanting to do more than someone else because then they'll look bad back home, so you don't get very much. The other interesting thing was the makeup of our delegation, which is like most delegations that went to Copenhagen, mostly diplomats and lawyers. When was the last time you saw a large group of diplomats and lawyers come up with something really innovative and bold? Well, maybe the creation of the United Nations in 1946 or whenever, but that's not really where things happen. Why not send in delegations environmental leaders, climate scientists, visionaries, people who want to do things? But we don't do that. The other culture in Washington that I was watching was the NGO culture. And while nothing was going right in Copenhagen or in the years leading up to it, we had emerging in the United States an anti-coal movement, coordinated nationally by the Sierra Club, but the fire in the belly for this movement came from the local groups, from local people being affected by pollution from coal-fired power plants, local people who couldn't eat the fish in our lakes because of the mercury deposition from the coal-fired power plants. And so we had this movement, and the first goal of the plan was to prevent the building of any new coal-fired power plants. That has more or less succeeded. We now have, in effect, a de facto moratorium. The second phase of this is to close existing coal-fired power plants, of which we have 492 in the United States. 71 of those are now slated to close in a matter of years. This is political action, mostly at the local level, though it's being reinforced by some of the things that are happening in Washington. But this is not primarily a Washington achievement. This is people at the local level, like you and me. And then we had recently, I don't know if it got much press coverage here, but Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, and the founder of Bloomberg News, he's been one of the most successful businessmen of his generation. He's now mayor of New York. He made a grant to the Sierra Club of $50 million to fund their Beyond Coal campaign. And he said very simply, coal has to go. Coal has to go. And it was interesting because of the role he occupies in the business community, or has occupied. I could say coal has to go. The president of the Sierra Club could say coal has to go. But when Michael Bloomberg says it, that's something that the business community listens to. Now, I mention this example because it's grassroots political action at its core, and it's working. We're going to keep closing coal-fired power plants in the United States until there are none left. How many years that will take is not clear yet, but we're moving. I cite that as an example of something that was happening while the media were covering, what was going to happen at Copenhagen, what did happen, and all the things that went on there, and how very little was accomplished. a lot was happening independently of that and independently of governments. So we can make a huge difference if we begin working on some of these issues in an organized way. We can literally change the energy system in a country as big as the United States, which happens to be the biggest economy in the world. So what we do will influence how people think about coal in other parts of the world. So then the coal companies had this great idea: if we can't sell the coal in the United States, we'll sell it to China. And so they wanted to build a port facility in northwestern United States in Seattle, which is the major port, to handle this coal. But the environmental groups organized with local people and would not license it. So to get coal to China, they have to go all the way up through Canada and try to go out through a Canadian port. But I mention this because it just gives a sense of how an organized grassroots political effort can begin to change, literally change the energy system in a huge country like the United States. I could give you other examples as well, but that's the answer to your question is become politically active. I mean, don't forget your homework, but become politically active. And it's an education. It's an important part of your education in the world that we're moving into.
Thank you very much.
I just want to add something briefly. Today, early afternoon, we've got a meeting in Lille, and on the stage there was a side Leicester. There was Mr. Rocket, the chairman and owner of a very big starch company, and on the other side there was Philippe Vasseur, a former Minister of Agriculture, and I was thinking to myself that it was amazing to see that these two gentlemen were not environmentalists, were not political, ecological leader. One has been the Minister of Chirac. They were speaking like the Green Party leaders 15 years ago. Now they take their message, and I think that time is coming to consider that the new paradigm, economical paradigm, is on the way, and the consciousness for the past 5 years has tremendously been developed regarding these ecological issues. Là au milieu. Vous aviez une question, je crois. Monsieur à lunettes, vous aviez une question?
So I have many questions, but I don't think we have time. My first one is, you have been talking about all the new green technologies which is developed, especially in Silicon Valley. You have been talking about electric cars, which has been developed by Better Place or Tesla Motors. And my question is, why would American authorities try so hard to buy the oil from Saudi Arabia and all those countries, when we know that more than 50% of the oil's resources are in 100 square kilometers in those between those countries? So why this is my first question. Why don't they try to invest in those new technologies besides oil? And my second one is yes, you have been talking at the beginning when you were now talking about agriculture, that the food index just rise because of the incident in Russia. But we know that there's many companies, and I would give you the example of Glencore, which is a company who trade 50% of Russia and Ukraine grains, and at the same time, Ivan Glasenberg, who is the broker who leads this company, has his fortune rise by $10 billion. So how come how can we develop those new ideas when financial power is just everywhere, and it doesn't give us some.
Could you summarize your question in one sentence?
Yes. So the first one is why America tries so hard to
invest in new technologies?
Not invest, but why they try to fight to help Saudi Arabia to produce their oil, and the second one is why how can we develop all what you've been talking about, such as wind energies and solar energies, when financial companies make money when when food index rise, how come he can make money when the price rise?
Yes. Let me respond to your second question first. There was a time when investment bankers accumulated capital to invest in productive things. They would invest in a factory or infrastructure or something that contributed directly to. But what we have seen, and we see this rather dramatically on Wall Street, is investment banking shifting from how to accumulate capital, invest in productive activities, to how to create new forms of paper for financial trading and so forth, forms of paper that some of them themselves don't even understand very well. And so it becomes a game on how to make money by trading in all these different financial things, but not how to build a better world. And so I think the investment community has gotten lost in the desire to make money. So I share the implications of your question here. And we attempted in the U.S. in legislation to remedy this, but in the end, the financial lobby, the banks that we had just finished rescuing because they had gotten into such serious trouble they were about to collapse. And we found that we couldn't really produce the legislation. I mean, there's some improvement, but not nearly enough to avoid a repeat of what we experienced 3 years ago, again at some point in the not too distant future. So I share your concern about what's happened in the financial community. It's dangerous. The question that I remember from what you mentioned earlier was how to invest in why invest in new technologies, I think was something you asked at one point. What we're beginning to see as we deal with these issues and try to understand what's happening in the world is that we need to change. We need big-time change. I mentioned Michael Bloomberg, the mayor of New York, who's wealthy. He doesn't have to worry about these issues unless he decides they're important enough that he wants to use some of his wealth to deal with them, like closing coal-fired power plants. Or I could give another example. We're in the process of beginning to develop offshore wind off the eastern coast of the United States. Google led a group of investors that are planning to build an offshore cable from roughly New York down to Norfolk, Virginia, with onshore links to feed electricity from the wind farms into the big cities like Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Washington, and so forth, the most densely populated part of the United States. And Google didn't have to do this, but they have quite a bit of capital to work with, and they want to build a future in which they can continue to do business. If the global economy starts to unravel, everyone's in trouble. And so we're beginning to see people acknowledge this and begin. I'm sure Google had never invested in an electrical transmission facility before, but this is a big one, big time, with $1 billion of their money going in. So we're beginning to see a change in thinking, and part of that is an educational challenge. We have to understand what's happening in the world and what the consequences are if we stay with business as usual. Philippe was mentioning the discussion we had today. I mean, you could not, if you didn't know who my two other panelists were, you couldn't guess that one was a very successful businessman and another a former cabinet member. I mean, they sounded, maybe I'm imagining this, but they sounded like me when they were talking. And that's progress. I mean, from where I sit, I see things happening. I see here in France, for example, a book being produced that complements what I've been writing about in the world, but this is what businesses have done in France to make a huge difference on the environmental front. So we're beginning to see the evolution of serious address of this. This book is not written by environmental groups. It's from corporations. I mean, if environmental groups had got together and said, we want to write a book about what France has done or can do or should do, that would be one thing. Every contributor to this is from is a corporate example of how you can make a difference. So this, to me, is encouraging, and it's an example of the kinds of change that we're beginning to see. But my message to you is a very simple one. We can all be part of this change process, and it does represent an enormous educational challenge. I have the luxury of being able to spend most of my time thinking about these things and analyzing trends all over the world on all sorts of things and trying to understand what's happening, and then the challenge is to put it together in books or in talks like this to help other people understand what's happening who don't have the luxury of spending as much time thinking about these things as I do. So my challenge to you is not to forget your homework, but get involved in some of these issues. It's a very exciting, satisfying thing. It also is educational. It is part of the educational process in the modern world.
Just to add one aspect of the question, I guess, is that the part of the question was, why do the United States invest so much in securing oil supply in the Middle East when they have access to this kind of green technologies?
The simple answer to that is the oil lobby. The oil lobby and coal lobby, but in this case oil, is a pretty powerful lobby. And the oil and coal industries have combined to launch a national disinformation campaign on climate change. And they've succeeded in creating doubts in the minds of many people. One, as to whether climate change is for real, and two, if it is, whether it's primarily of human origin or not. And these disinformation campaigns can be successful. It's exactly the same model that was used by the tobacco industry. But at some point, enough people become convinced that they lose their credibility, and everything changes. One of the most, I have an article in my briefcase. I have a lot of articles in my briefcase in various stages of development, but one is on what's happening with gasoline consumption in the United States. It has dropped 5% in the last 3 years, and we're seeing a number of new trends emerging. One is a changing attitude toward automobiles by young people. For example, when I was a teenager in a rural community in southern New Jersey, we socialized with cars or pickup trucks or what have you. Getting a driver's license and something to drive was a rite of passage. We all did it. In rural communities, you almost have to do something like that just to get to see, to meet other people and spend time with other people. So it was an important part of socializing for my generation, having a car. But today, when you look around the world, young people don't socialize with cars so much. Most socialization today is with cell phones and the internet. And it's an amazing change. The number of licensed teenage drivers in the United States today is less than it was 30 years ago, even though our population's increased enormously. And so the number of young people who are going to be buying cars, many of whom live in cities and don't need cars, is going down. So that's going to reduce gasoline consumption. The second thing that's happening is we're seeing this restructuring of cities in many places in the world to create a more pedestrian and bicycle-friendly environment and to improve public transportation. Almost every major city in the United States has things underway now. Mayor Bloomberg in New York is going to launch a bike share program in New York late this year, in fact, in just another couple months, with at least 10,000 bicycles and bike racks in New York City. So we're seeing changes. We're also looking at an increase in fuel efficiency in new cars in the United States by over half between now and 2025, I think it is, by a third by 2016. So new cars are becoming more efficient. Fewer people are buying them. More people are biking or using public transport. So there are a whole series of converging trends that are reducing gasoline consumption dramatically. The bottom line is, I don't think we're going to be very dependent on Saudi oil 5 years from now, and probably not at all by the end of this decade. So things are changing, and changing much faster than anyone would have realized. Now, the other thing I would point out is that electricity use in the United States is now dropping, and it's not just me. The Department of Energy is projecting that household electricity use will drop during this decade for the first time in probably close to a century. So things are beginning to happen on a scale that we've not seen before, and that includes reducing and eventually eliminating entirely our dependence on foreign oil.
Okay, so I think time is coming. We unfortunately have to stop now, and I want to thank the school for his welcome here tonight and for his contribution to the book, and for all the staff who have made this conference possible. I don't know if you want to say something, and maybe Lester gave a final invitation to the audience.
So I'm sure that there's a lot of questions in these young minds, but it's time for us. I want you to know, dear Lester, how your words are important for our students. I'm sure they're enough open-minded to understand what you said, even if in English maybe sometimes it's almost difficult. But I'm sure that your words today are, yes, very important for our students, because as you know, maybe they are here to prepare something, to prepare the future in a special way. Our students are here to work later in 2, 3, 4, 10 years, and in Africa, in Asia, in South America, maybe somewhere else. But when I see them, I can see that I'm very proud of them. And yes, I can say it's the first time. And I'm sure that we are together, your school, you and Leicester, in this evening, to work together for a better world. That's just, maybe it's very easy to say, very simple words, but if you don't catch these words, if you don't do these words yours, as Leicester wrote in this book, tomorrow, the world on the edge could be the world on the bad side. So please, catch these words, and now, act. Thank you, Udi.
Just a couple of thoughts on your own efforts. One, I think it's important today that we understand what's happening in the world. So keep an eye on the big picture. And secondly, don't let the formal education system narrow your thinking too much. One of the things we need is an interdisciplinary approach, a broad-based view. So taking as many courses in different fields as you can to try to understand that, I think, is going to be far more important than ever before. One of the weaknesses of our higher educational system generally is that the further you go, the more narrow your interest becomes, until finally you write a doctoral dissertation that's so narrow and so technical that no one can understand it other than a few other people who happen to be in the field. And I don't think I'm exaggerating all that much. And so maintain a mindset that's broadly inquisitive and inquiring and trying to understand what's happening in the world in an interdisciplinary sense. And then finally, I want to thank you for the invitation to be here tonight and a chance just to reflect a bit on my own agricultural roots, because I was once sitting where you're sitting today, and so I can identify with you probably in a way that not too many people here can, except for Philippe, who also has a degree in agronomy. But it's been sort of exciting for me to be able to share my own sort of evolution in terms of my agricultural background and training with you, with you who are also studying agriculture. So I've enjoyed this very much, and thank you for the invitation.